Hello and welcome to the Modern Day Thomist, where we parse classical wisdom to cultivate intellectual virtue today. I'm your host, MDT, and it's time for the first episode of the intersection of Catholicism and reason. Today we're delving into one of the offertory prayers from the Tridentine Mass, in the first of what's likely to be a two-part series. It begins, Deus qui humanae substantiae dignitatem mirabiliter condidisti, or in English, O God, who in creating human nature didst marvelously ennoble it. Recently at Mass, this phrase jumped out and punched me right in the face, so I had to write about it. It's so many interesting postulations rolled into a single clause. Before we jump into it, friends, I would like you to take a minute or three to consider, is human nature particularly noble? What are the propositions for or against its nobility? What the heck does nobility even have to do with it? Does anyone talk like that anymore? And would anyone understand them if they did? So, per usual, we'll begin with some definitions. Nature, from the Latin natur-a. Nature, the inner principle of the generation of a living thing. Commonly, the essence of a thing precisely as it is the source of its operations and activity. Anything viewed in its basic aspect, be it a substance or accident. That's from the Aquinas lexicon. Aristotle is said to have defined nature as the first principle of motion and rest in that in which it is, which I think adequately sums up the above definitions. Allow me to repeat. Nature is the first principle of motion and rest in that in which it is. I would also like to add that nature is the same as essence. It is the principle of limitation in anything that defines what it is. We'll get into that concept briefly in a moment. But first, two things. One, if you can add a word to your lexicon that you know, forward, backward, left, right, upside down, nature would be a good place to start. Nature and essence. All right, the principle of being. Everything that is has a principle that causes it to be. Without a being principle, there would be nothing to move a potential being, which we refer to by the Latin ens, E-N-S, nothing to move a potential being to actual being. But a principle of being in itself only makes a thing to be, and if left unfettered, the thing to which it imparts being would be without limit. It would be everything. Let me say that again. If you have a principle that makes you be, and that principle is not limited, then it is by definition unlimited. If you were to be in an unlimited fashion, you would be everything. So, we're talking about a principle of being at the moment. Here in a minute we'll talk about a principle of limitation, which defines being as what it is. In order to avoid the catastrophe of being everything, we see around us that every being also has a limiting factor. Except for God, of course, but more on that in another installment. All right, the principle of limitation, also known as essence, or essens in Latin, the present participle of esse, to be. In order for a thing to be and yet not be everything, a principle of limitation is in order. You be, and I be, and the cat which is sleeping on my couch bees or is being, but we are being different. I, a human, have the confines of my persona and my body, and I'm assuming you do too. The cat is feline and is not human, so there's a distinction. Furthermore, it's this cat and not another cat, which sleeps upon my couch. There's another distinction. These are all limitations on the principle of being. If not for the limits, the definitions between individual beings, there would be no difference between this cat and that cat, my cat and your cat. We would be in a Parmenidean agglomeration of being where everything is being and nothing changes because everything is one. No, thank you. My sleeping cat would thereby incorporate all things pertaining to cattiness, because it would be indistinct from any other cat. With no distinction, it would be all cats, with all of the perfections therein. We of course know that there is a difference between this cat and that cat, between this human and that human, between cats and humans in general. So we intuitively understand that there is a principle of limitation which makes a thing to be the particular thing it is, and not anything else. Furthermore, if not for the limits between natures, there would be no essential difference between the cat and me. We would be the same kind of animal. That is why we refer to essence as the mode of being within a thing, or the manner in which a thing is being. We of course know that there is a difference between a cat and a dog, a whale and a shrimp, a man and a woman. Well, scratch that. Maybe we don't of course know. And isn't that why we're here? Perhaps we think it's easy to distinguish between a guppy, a border collie, a young girl, and a middle school boy. Perhaps the boy doesn't think that there's any distinction at all, and his teachers tell him that he can be whatever he wants, whatever he feels like. This obviously has significant ramifications regarding the Transformers social epidemic, if you know what I mean, if one approaches it with a rational outlook. But we'll get to that in due time. Gotta lay a comprehensive foundation first, then erect the framework, and then demonstrate why and how they are wrong a fortiori. Dignity, from the Latin dignit-as, stemming from dignus, which is worthy, suitable, fitting, proper, from the Aquinas lexicon. We can see from the Latin that the actual word used in the Mass was dignitatem, so that's a good clue that the translators use the words nobility and dignity interchangeably. Nobility, from the Latin nobilit-as, nobilitatis, noble or excellent quality, excellence, superiority, dignity, from the Aquinas lexicon. The essence of nobility seems to be an ontological excellence which is worthy of praise. That's my own phrasing there. Let me know what you think of it. An ontological excellence which is worthy of praise. Of course, whether a characteristic is excellent or defective has a lot to do with the nature of the thing in question. We wouldn't prize a batch of gold bullion that was brittle and flaky, but we would certainly appreciate a croissant that was golden, crunchy, and flaky. Noble, nobil-is, having qualities or properties of a very high or admirable kind, characterized by moral superiority or dignity, in particular, renowned, famous, noble, illustrious by rank, birth, or title. Again from the Aquinas lexicon. A discussion about the essence of nobility would be incomplete without considering in what ways a thing is said to be noble. A thing is said to be noble in 5 ways, I believe. Between individuals, the comparison would be made by relative levels of 1. Natural perfection, 2. Superadded perfection, 3. Association with something complementary or more perfect. Between genera, the comparison would be made according to the limiting principles proper to each genus. Within the thing itself, the comparison would be made according to the ontological perfection achieved corporately by the thing or the genus, versus the ontological perfection that might have possibly been corporately achieved by the thing or the genus. Great. Now that I've confused one or more of you, let's go back and parse that briefly. So bearing in mind that these 5 categories of judging nobility are my own parsing on the matter, I would like you to provide feedback if there's anything you have to add or any different way in which you would divide these same things. We'll start with the first one, which was relative levels of natural perfection. So natural perfection covers any virtue or trait that is attainable for most individuals by natural means, which would cover all of the natural virtues, as well as bodily integrity, and any comparison of accidents between 2 individuals of the same species. What does all that mean? Well, for instance, this dog has a more pleasing sheen to its coat than that one. That is a relative comparison of natural perfections. Or, this woman runs faster than that woman. Or even, a four-legged horse is better than a three-legged dog, because we're covering bodily integrity in this category. These are all comparisons between the natural perfections of two individuals of the same species, or the integrity of two individuals of different species. That way it's always an apples-to-apples comparison. We may not be able to directly compare a horse and an octopus, for instance, but we can compare their relative integrity. This horse is more whole as a horse than that octopus is as an octopus because it's missing half of its arms, or something similar to that. It would be silly to say that dun horses are better than brindle dogs because these accidents have no common context between species with which to predicate the comparison. St. Thomas has something to say on that, but I'll save the deeper discussion for another time. The second category, relative comparison of superadded perfection, covers any virtue or trait that is not attainable by natural means. There are tales of saints with preternatural gifts, such as subsisting on water and the Eucharist, preaching to animals, bilocating, reading the intentions and surface thoughts of certain people at certain times, levitation, healing, shining with heavenly splendor, etc. These are ontological perfections that reside outside the natural capacity of human nature, and so they can be said to be superadded to human nature. If you have ever looked at any religious art and you've seen someone depicted with a halo or an aura about them, that is an artistic reference to exactly what we're talking about. That's saying that this person with the bigger halo or the bigger aura or the brighter color of halo is more perfect in a superadded perfection than the person with no halo or a lesser halo. The third category, associated perfection, refers to nobility imparted by the relationship between things. When we see a thing ensconced upon an ornate pedestal, for instance, we would assume it to have some perfection or value that made it deserving of such a place of honor, and so we would esteem it more. Whether that esteem is misplaced is a discussion for another time, but we generally recognize additional nobility in a thing the closer it is in relation to a more perfect or complementary thing. We say that the Son sits at the right hand of the Father as a sign of respect and deference, because to be positioned at the right hand of a ruler is a noble perfection, even though it has nothing to do with the degree of natural perfection of the thing in question, and cannot be said to be a superadded perfection, because it is not added to the nature of the thing, but it merely adorns the nature of the thing. The fourth category was limiting principles compared between genera. If I asked you if you would rather be a snail or a cheetah, I wager that some people may place an immense value on some particular quality of the snail, but that most would instead choose to be a cheetah. This kind of decision is based upon a comparison of the limiting principles between the two. Cheetah nature is far less limited than snail nature, and so in most cases it would be better to be a cheetah than a snail. The divide grows exponentially if the choice must be made between being a plant or an animal. It is plain to see that animals have all the powers of a plant, nutrition, growth, and reproduction, and then some, and so animals can be said to be more noble than plants according to the fact that their essence is less limiting. They can be said to be ontologically greater because they have more being. That's a very useful concept. And the fifth category was actual nobility vis-a-vis potential nobility. We can see whether a thing has actualized a greater or lesser amount of its potential nobility. For instance, we can see that a once great man has become a husk of his former self in matters of virtue, and say that he is not very noble these days, not nearly so much as he had previously been. One could make the same comparison of a species, or genera, versus its own potential. We might say, for instance, that humanity, generally speaking, is far less noble at certain times than at others. And accordingly, we can also compare humanity at its peak actualized nobility to the potential that humanity has to be ennobled. This is fairly similar to the first point above, and yet it's distinct enough to warrant its own entry on the list, I think. Let me know in the comments what you think about it. I'm always interested in coming to a greater understanding of the truth, and sometimes that means I have to admit that I'm wrong and move on from there. So let me know anything that you have to say, and we'll discuss it. Hopefully you can teach me a few things. As far as principles to keep in mind for this episode, I think we're going to stick with one, and that is the lesser exists in service of the greater. We'll uncover and explore this principle throughout the conversation, but in a nutshell, it is as it sounds, describing that there is a natural hierarchy to things, and prescribing that that which is generally ontologically inferior ought to support and further the needs of that which is greater. This is bound to be a hotly contested topic, and it can be misapplied in a million ways, but I'll cut some of that short right here by saying that this principle can in no way be applied to justify human slavery. Not misogyny, not... Humanity is all on equal footing, ontologically speaking, until we get to our second nature, right, the habits that we assume, and we can make some distinction between the relative levels of nobility in people based upon what virtues and vices they have allowed into their lives and to what extent. But this doesn't take us off the same shelf. I mean, we're all humans at the end of the day, and so it's very difficult, if not totally preposterous, to say that, oh, this person is lesser than that person, and so they ought to exist in service of that person. That's not where this is going. A lot hangs on that single word generally as well, but we'll get into that at another time. I think that definition of principle suffices for the moment. Alrighty, with all that said, I'd love to get straight to the ennobling of human nature in se, but I'd like to lay a little more groundwork regarding the nobility of the human animal vis-a-vis other animals, as well as the nobility of particular humans amongst the whole of humanity. I think there's a lot of fertile ground there, so I'll try not to be hasty. Another avenue we could go down, if anyone is interested, is in the semantics of the original Latin of the prayer above. I dabble in Latin, I have a couple years of study under my belt, and many years of fumbling through ecclesial texts, and some secular texts as well. I have formulated my own opinions on the translation of the prayer, but before I just blurt out a slightly tweaked translation of the text, I'd like to know if there's any interest in it. So if you'd like to begin that discussion, please post your thoughts in the comments. What is special about humanity? If an indie reporter was to approach you randomly on the street with his GoPro in hand and ask if you thought you had inherent value and rights, I suspect the average person would answer yes. If that same reporter followed up with a request that you convince him you have inherent value, or why you deserve rights, I suspect the average person would have a somewhat unsatisfactory answer, as it's much easier to claim something for yourself than it is to demonstrate that such a claim is valid. Let's begin as an exercise by examining the fundamental unit of an element, and then we'll scale up from there. A carbon atom, for instance, has no rights, and I dare say it has little intrinsic value, although it does have some. If a carbon atom is about to be subsumed by a chemical reaction, I don't think there is just cause to say, wait, you can't do that because the carbon atom has a right to exist unto itself. And nobody has ever marched down the street shouting, carbon atoms matter, although in this particular age, I don't think that many of us would find that to be too far-fetched. Please let me know in the comments if you disagree. What's the next step up? Carbon-based vegetative life forms, I'd wager. Does the turnip in your garden have rights? Or does it have inherent value? What about the bindweed pushing up through the cracks of your driveway? Do you hesitate to harvest the turnip or to spray the bindweed with herbicide? Where do the rights of the turnip end and the rights of the aphids begin? Do you even care? And what of the inherent value of the turnip? Does it have much inherent value to you, beyond the fact that it's nutritious and doesn't taste too bad? And if you don't care, or you can't decide, or if you can't see a better way to do things than spraying the bindweed in your driveway and eating the turnip with your supper, is that a moral failure on your part? I'd wager not, but again, let me know in the comments if you disagree. We'll get into the reasoning more in just a little bit. So what's the next step up? Let's go with the illustrious cockroach, a fine example of sensitive life. What rights does the cockroach have? More practically speaking, can we start a class action lawsuit against the makers of Raid bug spray on behalf of the cockroaches? But in all seriousness, this is where people start to really diverge. I don't know of anyone that would assign great value to the life of a cockroach, or argue that a cockroach has rights. But what about a cheetah, or even an elephant, a dolphin, or an ape? What value do we assign to their lives? What rights do we recognize for them? And most importantly, why? The Canadian Declaration of Rights for Cetaceans would have you believe that dolphins are non-human persons and retain the rights to life and liberty which we must respect. Must we? Is it a moral failing if we do not respect the rights of life and liberty for dolphins? I ask again, why? The Great Ape Project would recognize that apes have the rights to life, liberty, and freedom from torture. Why? The Non-Human Rights Project would extend personhood to elephants with all the rights therein. Why? Is there anything wrong with any of that? And what does any of this have to do with the marvelous ennobling of human nature? All in good time, we're getting there. I posit that the reason nobody cares about the lowly cockroach, but we have no shortage of people up in arms about apes, chimps, elephants, dolphins, octopi, and the like, is that we see that these things have identifiable similarities to us humans, and so we hate to think of harm befalling things which are relatively noble. The devil is in the details, though, and the truth is that the gap between humanity and any of these brutes remains infinite. So the more extreme fondness that people develop for them is largely misplaced. They would be so much better off reserving their fondness and sympathy for the hundreds of thousands of immature humans we butcher every year, because at the moment of conception the human zygote is immeasurably more noble and more valuable than the most majestic elephant that will ever live. And of course, in all of this conversation, I use the term brute with fondness and appreciation here. It's not a pejorative, it's just reality. Their mode of thinking is distinct from our own. But how can you possibly say that, MDT, you might ask? Well, Aristotle answers this in his History of Animals, the Historia Animalium, Volume 8. Simply put, they are not rational animals. No amount of seeming similitude will alter that fact. The highest species or members of a particular genus will closely mimic some qualities of the lowest species or members of an ontologically superior genus. In this case, we can say that the most noble of the brute animals will closely mimic the least noble of the rational animals. Note that we're not talking about traditional scientific taxonomy here, but using the terms species and genus in their least specialized sense, perhaps, or a lesser specialized sense, anyway. The elephants, octopi, dolphins, and such closely mimic some qualities of intellect, and so we empathize with them when we see them distressed. But that is more an emotional reaction than a well-reasoned one. And while it speaks to our own nobility that we harbor a love of their relative nobility, no amount of empathy will ever cause a herd of elephants to sit around and discuss the nature and merits of nobility, and so they will forever remain incalculably less valuable than the most ignoble human to ever walk the earth. And since the origin of rights in the abstract is inextricably tied to free will and understanding, which are intellective in nature, there is no room for discussion of animal rights in the abstract, in the case of brute animals. But wait, MDT, let's talk about the real difference between brute animals and rational animals, you might say. And to that I would answer, that's a conversation for next time. I think I've taken enough of your time today. That's it for part 1 of our brief look at human nobility. I know we didn't get to the heart of the matter yet, but we've built up a solid substrate from which we can take an educated look at the initial prayer, Deus qui humanae, This has been necessarily brief, though I'm sure that Dom Guéranger could easily have written a two-part series of books on the topic, but we're here to backfill and cross-reference as needed. So post any questions, any disagreements, any personal epiphanies that you'd like to share. We'll discuss them in the next part, or maybe down the road at some point. Feel free to write me directly at the email provided if you have something that you'd like to take up in a more one-on-one manner, rather than a group setting. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, sign up for notifications, share this with your friends. The more people we can have on board, the better, I think. Making our way through the wisdom of St. Thomas is a necessary step in this world. Standards of education have fallen so low, I never cease to be amazed by what people will believe uncritically, without even thinking about it, just because, hey, somebody else said it, and that person was in a position of authority, or, hey, they had a piece of paper hanging up on their wall that says they know what they're talking about, so I better listen to them. That's not the way this goes. Education is democratized. You have your knowledge that you have acquired through your senses, and I have my knowledge that I have acquired through my senses, and the senses are where all knowledge begins. And so what you have to say and what I have to say is valuable. And I'm just floored by the fact that people skip right past that and say, oh, let's listen to the experts on everything. So I thank you that you're here. Let's get as many people on board as possible to spread the word that we don't need to just rely on experts. We're all smart here. We can all cultivate intellectual virtue. We can all bring our own position to the table and sort it out like adults and come to a greater understanding. At the end of the day, the only philosophy you have is the philosophy that you understand. So friends, I'm glad you're here. Have a great day. We'll see you in the next one. All the pictures and movies that you see throughout this video are my property. I took them. I've been hiking in a lot of really beautiful places with a lot of really cool people. If you would like to hear any of the stories, if you would like to use any of the pictures, please get in touch with me for the originals, and you'll have my blessing moving forward. Please don't just hijack them yourself. Thank you.